I want to thank you for talking to us and letting me be a part of this conversation about your work. So I thought a great thing to start with is tell us about what the work is about.
Okay, so the project started when I was looking at how to describe an experience of multiple traumas in an area that was related to me, related to my family, and trying to look at how I could explain that to other people, how I could articulate something when I didn't have all of the information available to me, but also kind of oscillating between sort of multiple experiences and personal experiences and not relying too heavily on a purely documentary approach.
Okay. So how would you describe that you went kind of through that? So
Well, I think the very, very start of this project, I was on a residency in Wexford, and I started looking at sort of how I could photograph fear. So I was walking through the woods kind of, and I could see my own breath, and I was trying to photograph that. So this idea of trying to photograph an emotional state and trying to make that sort of kind of the embodiment of that and how I could work on that photographically was one thing. And then kind of combined with that, I was looking at sort of things like the Ryan report, the Mahon report, which were kind of government sexual abuse cases in Dublin and in Ireland specifically, and just kind of how all those sort of things tied together. So there was a lot kind of to process and a lot to grapple with, I suppose.
And rather than the specific narrative, you want the viewer to look at, to be aware of implicit memory, right?
Yeah, that was the initial entry point. When I started on the MFA, I was looking at a lot of psychology research. So one of the key things in that was this idea that sort of trauma, it's quite similar to Michelle talking about Bessel van der Kolk. He was another one of my references. But also this idea that kind of literally trauma gets stored in the body, and how you kind of, your muscles and your mind kind of remember certain things that, you know, you're kind of not 100% sure. So one of the examples I have is of a doctor who was treating a woman who had memory loss, and to kind of test this theory of how her memory loss worked. Every morning he'd greet her, her husband would bring her to the doctor's office and he'd shake her hand, and then one morning he put a pin in the palm of his hand, and when he went to shake her hand, obviously she was injured, and then the next day when they went to greet each other, she refused to shake his hand, but she couldn't say why, she couldn't remember why, but obviously there was something happening underneath that where physically her body was trying to protect itself from danger. So that kind of as a concept was really interesting to me. So
Technical difficulty. Okay. I can shout. I'm very loud. We won't need this mic if y'all don't. Like the internet can hear me from here if you want me to. So, do you want to talk us through the images? Through this image, and then.
Well, I was hoping just to have, just a few of the different works that I was going through. Just to give you a sense of seeing some of the work, I'm happy to talk about any kind of
process. Talk about like the first image. What are we looking at? What are the viewers?
Well, this is kind of earlier on in the project. I started walking around kind of areas of significance to me, and obviously. You good?
It looks like I broke like one of those GoPros.
I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. So I suppose at the start, I spent a lot of time walking around areas that kind of held significance to me, and what I found was trying to communicate that, especially with the class, just because it was of a site that evoked memories or evoked associations with my personal experience, that didn't really translate across the board, obviously. So in that regard, it was more about a case of looking at a visual strategy, and that's when kind of the black and white kind of side of things came in. You know, I sort of thought that having a very strong kind of visual aesthetic would be the best way to communicate a tone, more so than people getting caught up on the location itself, you know?
Right, because, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was more about this kind of gathering information.
Yeah.
Rediscovering history, using archive, using family and community stories to try to retrace a history.
Yeah.
But rather than talking about the history, it's more about the kind of results of that history.
Yeah, well, that's literally it. I mean, I think a big concern of mine earlier on was that if it went too far down a documentary route, there was a lot of people that were so quick to kind of identify, okay, well, who are we talking about? Where are we talking about? And I'm like, okay, that's fine to some degree, but that's not the aim that I'm trying to achieve here. Isn't literally nailing down details so that people can look at something and go, okay, that's what happens to people in that community, from that family, from that experience, you know.
Yeah, you wanted to make it a lot more universal.
I'm making it a lot more universal and much more grounded in a sense of an emotional state, and more so it was about kind of how people hold kind of the residue of a trauma, you know. So like, again, a lot of the research is based in, everyone is kind of familiar with fight or flight, but usually with women and children, the response is usually freeze or appease. So what I'm looking at is the kind of freeze response and the appeasing response, and how they kind of complicate things a little bit more. The results of that would be a little bit more nuanced and then lesser known to people.
I think that's a perfect segue to your next image about the freeze, and you know. So tell us about this image.
Yeah. So with this tree, it's taken at the back of a prison in Dublin, and this is a space that I kind of went to when I was feeling a little bit sort of exasperated with trying to chase down what's the truth. This person says this person says that. So a lot of the difficulties with this, I spoke to a family member who kind of said, like, if you're trying to talk about things, it's like having a load of wallpaper in an old house and specifically trying to peel away one layer of wallpaper without anything that came before or afterwards being attached to it. It's absolutely impossible. And that kind of sense of how everything is sort of a rat's nest of complications and contradictions. And, you know, for some people's experience, it can be completely one way, and someone else will explain or perceive something completely in an opposite way. But for those people, their truths feel very real to them, you know? So being sensitive to that kind of the different interpretations that people have is something that very much came into the work as well.
Right, and I found that you photographed very heavy, solid things, like bricks and buildings.
Yeah.
You know, talk about this camera, because we've talked about this camera in this image a lot. You know, the kind of...
Oh, well, yeah, this is a funny thing, is that the space behind that, like, at the time when we were talking about this in class, everyone, there's the assumption that it's a camera. It's actually a sensor light. It's a sensor light. So but it does have, it's why I kind of kept that version. I had another shot from a slightly different angle, which I quite liked as well. And I think in the class as well, people were very interested in the brick detail. But definitely with this, it's a sensor light, so
it still records presence.
It gives people that kind of, you know, you're watching, you're being watched, that kind of oscillating feeling of who's kind of the real person in control, or that kind of a sensation. So I think definitely that idea of surveillance and monitoring and that kind of hardness of a space is something that it's definitely visible in all of the images. Well, on to the next one.
Yeah. Tell me about this one.
So again, similarly, this is the visitors' room in the same prison on the grounds, and this was one that this was when I was kind of like walking around, still kind of thinking things through and photographing different spaces that just, you know, trying to, again, similarly with Michelle, that you're kind of going with your gut on things, which wouldn't be 100%. That wouldn't be where I've come from photographically. It's always been commercial and
very much. But I also think, similar to Michelle, you're trying to photograph something that doesn't exist. You've got a lost history, a lost memory, and the way that you're trying to kind of explore that is through stories, which are very subjective. You know, family histories, community histories, and so again, using the camera and the medium of photography to photograph something that is missing, I think was very, very interesting when I was, you know, and I think, you know, the work, particularly using. This is not just, there's a little detail in this that I think is very relevant to what, you know, is a little bit of a nod to.
Yeah, well, the child's playhouse in the space is kind of something that, I mean, I remember posting this image quite earlier on on Instagram, and some friends who knew the space were like, felt the significance of it quite heavily. So it resonates in a certain way with people, but again, the way it's shot is obviously people can sort of get that feeling.
Well, it's very matter of fact. You know, it's very, but you do these little digs, like the light and these little tiny subtle things that just kind of chip away. Like the wallpaper is kind of a metaphor you've kind of used throughout your project. Is this kind of layer by layer, bit by bit, and then some layers you'll go through and it's a whole, you know, like it's not another layer.
Well, it's that kind of gut punch then. But I suppose like some of the visual references at the time, I'd hugely be interested in, like The Night of the Hunter and The Innocents, and they're very stark black and white kind of films, and that kind of research was much more related to a concept of a child navigating an adult space or having a secret, or that kind of dynamic, and that kind of, again, that sort of lurching stomach sort of feeling. So a lot of the visuals were trying to emulate that kind of aesthetic, you know, because immediately people sort of go into that space, you know.
You want to go to the next image?
There's our, I think it's our set. I added in another final image that I don't have on the wall. Amazing teaser.
Okay, so talk about this one.
So this one was more in the space again, and I think much more related to when I was younger, just walking around and kind of your imagination being, you know, trying to express how you're feeling in a certain space. So less so with the others about being a side of significance. It was in the location, in the area, but again, this was more to do with the idea of sort of a portal, and kind of this idea of, you know, entering into this other world, or kind of framing things in a fairy tale like story. A nod to that, because obviously it's such a difficult subject matter to walk around with all the time, to think about all the time. So I definitely found that kind of coming out of that a little bit and moving it into that sort of essentially kind of folkloric kind of methodology just made it a little bit more comfortable to work with, you know, because it's a lot to work with.
There's a lot to unpack.
2 years straight to have constantly, that's all your research and stuff, so it was heavy.
Well, I think you did well. Like when this image is, there's layers. I noticed you use a lot of formal qualities and layers, and keeping, like, even though they're slightly playful, there's always this kind of barrier, and you know there is an entryway, but there's also a barrier to kind of keep people at arm's length. And that, you know, I think is something that, you know, it's very subtle, but if you look throughout the images, I think, you know, that's something that I've noticed.
There's a hostility to it.
Well, it's not, I wouldn't call it hostility. I would say it's almost like a self, you know, protection.
It's a protective measure. And I think that's sort of, like, so much of the work is very much how I've been navigating the subject matter for the last couple of years, is that you kind of want to know, but you're not ready to know, and you're not sure if you know, and so it's that kind of, it feels like walking around, you know, a building, trying to find the entry point, trying to tap to where the wall is weak so you can get through, you know, and it's that kind of sense
Well, would you give
suppose.
anybody advice who's interested in working in something so personal? Like, would you have any advice for them?
Yeah, like I think similar to what Michelle was talking about. Sorry, Michelle. I think it is very tricky to work on something that you're still processing in the moment.
Yeah.
So again, that's something you have to be very cautious of. And I think I have to be honest, the college are amazing with kind of, you know, talking through how to
Objective?
how to process the work, how to talk about the work, and even with, you know, the services in the college, you know, that they would let me go there and, you know, do a presentation with them. They're like, if you ever need to do that, you're saying something out loud for the first time in a safer space than necessarily in a crit, where it's still a safe space, but it's about the work. It's not
Right.
about your personal experience.
Exactly.
And those two things are very different.
Yeah,
so
and you
it's
have to
important
learn.
to know.
You have to learn how to separate that.
Yeah, which is
Because-
huge.
Right, right. I mean, you have to. It's like you know, you're basically your story, your personal. And so when people are critiquing the work, it's real easy to think that they're critiquing.
Oh, massively. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's something that you do just have to learn. And I love how your way of thinking is always like, it's like a science experiment. You try it this way, you try it this way, you try it this way. What are our results? What do we learn? What do we get from that? Where do we go next? You know, so that approach is a lot more, you know, it's much more tangible with, you know, going forward with how to do things, whereas you can get overwhelmed by just the subject matter itself.
You know, and I think people are just kind and they want to ask, and then it's up to the maker to say, like, you know, bring it back to the work.
Yeah.
You bring it back to the work, whether it's this kind of topic or, you know, any kind of thing. And I think you did
100%.
really, really well with that throughout. So yeah.
Cool. We got here.
Yeah, we're here. You want to talk about the next one?
This is the very last one.
Uh-huh.
So that was the more looser kind of spaces. This was obviously not in so much of a built up area, but again, it was this idea of just being in a space where it's kind of you're sort of swamped and it's overwhelming. And again, I think that ties into how I wanted everything to be printed so big, was the scale of feeling childlike, feeling small, feeling kind of stuck in a space. So again, it's playing with that idea of the freeze mode and just being kind of small and overwhelmed.
Yeah, so that's a great segue to talk about the printing of the work is not just big, but it's also talk about the surface. I'm sorry, you know, internet people, you know, but how big are they printed?
They're massive. That's
give us some numbers for massive.
That's the official. Well, basically, I got the specs. I got onto the guys in Belfast Exposed, and I was like, look, just send me the measurements. And then I was like, okay, so that's the size of the wall. That's the size the print's going to be. So, yeah, they're pretty big.
Okay, so do we have an estimation of numbers?
I can't think of the exact numbers.
Okay, so I didn't take the clue on that. So let's just say they are, they're, you know, larger than life. They're larger than you know, if you're standing in front of them, you're definitely much smaller than them. And then the paper that it's not framed on a wall with glass, but they're printed on.
Yeah, there's one where the prison visiting room is on vinyl.
Yep.
And then the other ones on this wall here are on rice paper. So it's the idea that they're kind of, when people walk by, there's a little bit of movement, there's a bit of, you know, that it's almost like someone standing over you, kind of, that it's like floating a little bit. So it's that kind of shadow, a moving shadow or a spectre, or, you know, that kind of.
Yeah, also
it's all about making you feel uneasy, really, which is the hugest part of the work is it's an emotional state that I want to bring you to, you know.
Exactly. So that the image with the tree being as a gigantic wall-sized vinyl, and then these others that are just kind of floating, again capturing the ephemeral, and, you know, not only scaring you but also, you know, capturing the path of wind.
Yeah.
And again, trying to create a history of something that doesn't exist. So yeah, I think, you know, I think the presentation fit what you were trying to achieve very well.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think when you, from the beginning, when we started talking, you didn't want it to be a documentary, you know, you mentioned that.
Yeah.
And that the way of bringing it out of that context and putting the viewer into more of a visceral space
Mm-hmm.
is the way you've done it.
Yeah,
And that's-
well, I think it's definitely, it's a specific perspective of mine, of my understanding of things from a younger mental state,
Yeah.
you know? So
Yeah.
it's not going to be complete hard facts, and I don't want people to receive it as something that's a straight up documentary.
Okay.
So,
Yeah. All right. Well, are we done
Yeah,
with this
yeah,
project?
we're-
Or?
oh no.
Sorry.
Well, I think a lot of the research that I did during the MFA
Uh-huh.
has gotten to a stage now where I actually want to write about that. So that's the next.
So writing.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Writing
That's great.
is definitely next on the cards.
That is great. That's fabulous. Okay. With that,
So-
we'll end and see if anybody has any questions.
Okay, so any questions from the audience?
Hi, Aoife. I just wondering about, when you just say about the writing, could you just say a bit more about that? Is it where you hope to go with the writing, or?
Well, I'm putting a book proposal together at the moment for how kind of photographically we visualize trauma. So a lot of the work based on kind of when I was doing kind of writing for the dissertation, I kind of found that I was finding things, but it was all either in like social geography or in psychology, or it was very new photographic work that hadn't been written about kind of in a critical environment yet. So I'm kind of piecing together a lot of that at the moment, because there's so much there, and I think it's just really there's a huge prevalence of how this kind of work is made, just in different, like, unless you're looking for it, you're not going to see it. But once you start kind of turning over the stones of what's going on, there's really a lot happening at the moment.
So do you imagine like an editorial, like you'll be an editor, maybe write some essays, but then bring in some other writers and some other
I
artists?
don't know. I'd happily write about it all myself, to be honest. But I mean, obviously, with something like this, you can't really speak for everyone's perspective. So that's where I'm trying to research how best to do that at the moment.
I think
you know?
I think you're an editor.
But yeah,
Bring
cool. Yeah.
bring all the people together and create the
Yeah.
voice.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
So
Any other questions?
Or anyone else for questions?
No.
All right, thank you very much.
Thanks so much.